Our final speaker today is Matt Stephens, the inventor of the Hollowhog, a revolutionary tool designed to create boutique habitats for hollow-dependent wildlife. With over 16 years as the director of Hollowhog, Matt's innovation provides an immediate solution to a problem that naturally takes over a century to resolve. He will share how this tool has transformed habitat creation. Please welcome Matt.
Thank you very much. And the 16 years is probably a little bit wrong. So 16 years is my company, but Hollowhog itself, I started delving into the world of hollows probably around 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, and thinking about all of the different issues of it, and that kind of transpired in Hollowhog coming out about a few years ago. So anyway, my name's Matt Stephens. So I'm an ecologist, studied at Sydney Uni many years ago, and then I also got to spend about 3 years here at TAFE, where I did an associate diploma in applied science back in the 1990s with people like Judy Fakes and who else was there? You know, a whole range of people that some of you would know around the place. Look, and just want to acknowledge country and also add on to what Dan had said earlier about the threads of what we're doing. So, you know, you step off into a tiny patch of bushland in Sydney that's got remnant trees in it, and you can think, you know, how long those trees have been there. And some of them will have been there before white fellas turned up in this place, and here they are persisting. But not only that time frame, there are also species that have evolved here, and that's millions and millions of years, and we're the custodians of those patches of bush and those species now, and it's really up to us to see how we can work to make sure that they persist long into the future. And so as part of that, obviously plants are super important, as are animals, and the animals that inhabit our forests, and then how they interact with the plants. And so the whole system combining together, and we have this ecosystem out there just humming along. And so as part of what I was considering when I was, I'll go back a bit. So my day job is, or has been up until very recently, involved in setting up biodiversity stewardship agreements. So they're stewardship agreements through Biodiversity Conservation Trust. These were all being set up for, thank you, these were all being set up for road projects. So they were biodiversity offsets, which is controversial in itself. But it gave me an opportunity to be involved in managing about 10,000 hectares of forested land on the east coast of Australia. And so that's setting up 36 conservation agreements between Port Macquarie and the Queensland border. As part of that, I got to visit hundreds and hundreds of properties. And wandering around these properties, you're looking around and, you know, there's some big, substantial trees, kind of like this. And I'm thinking, wow, you know, old growth forest, isn't this awesome? And then eventually we got to this one property, and the guy who owned it was an ecologist as well. And he said, look, I hunted down this place. It took me years to find it. He said, come with me and I'll show you. And we walked around the bend, and there was this absolutely, like, just gigantic black butt. It was absolutely huge. And he said, that's old growth. And he said, everything else you've seen has been manipulated and altered. He said, the reason? Because it's all been logged and it's been clear felled or whatever. And he said, it's not until you see the structure like this that you know how much our landscape's been altered. And that really kind of threw my mind a spin. I'm thinking, well, okay. And I was actually flying on a plane that week, and I was flying from the Gold Coast all the way down the East Coast, and there's forest as far as you can see. And just to think that the majority of that forest has been impacted through logging processes, through whatever it is. And through that, those processes, we've lost one of the most valuable resources for a lot of our native species. So there's about roughly between a quarter and a third of our native vertebrate species use hollows. And if we looked at it as a proportion of species that live in forests, it's much, much higher than that. And so that's a huge, huge diversity of species that use hollows. And the other thing we know is we've got damn hard timbers in this country, so eucalypts, and they take a very, very long time before hollows start to form in them, on average. There can be instances where it's pretty rapid, but on average, it'll take a long time. So for a hollow to form that's going to be about the size of my fist, you plant your tree, for example, 70 years later, you might get a hollow the size of your fist in that tree. And there's a lot of our species are quite a lot bigger than that size of the fist. They're not all as lucky as the pygmy possum that's very happy to nest in a little space. So, and it can take 120, 200, 300 years for a hollow to form naturally. So as part of what I was doing, I was kind of considering all of the different attributes of hollows and fauna. Can I just get you to just click it for me? If we can get it to work. We're just struggling to get the PowerPoint to work. Just that one, yeah. So anyway, so as part of the process, I was starting to think, well, what can we do for fauna? Like, how can we solve this problem? Separately, I'm reading these reports coming through about nest boxes. And nest boxes have been traditionally used across lots and lots of different projects around the place as a measure to try and compensate for the loss of tree hollows. So anyway, one of these reports came through and it effectively said that all of these nest boxes that were being placed of the species that we're using, we were getting brush-tailed possums and a couple of other common species. None of the target threatened species were using those nest boxes. And then to add insult to injury, half of them were on the ground within 7 years. So they were being eaten out by termites, as you said about the ants. They get in, they cause a change in the box, or cockies were turning up and ripping the lids off them, and they were all being hit by storm damage. So it got me thinking, okay, so there's got to be a way to think about how you can do this differently. I started investigating, looking, and this was probably in the early 2010s, somewhere in there, started looking into concepts like inoculation with fungi to try and see if I can introduce rot and decay into trees to speed up that process. I started looking into wood dissolving enzymes to see if I could work out how to work that out. Sent off an email to some bloke researcher in the UK. Anyway, I never got a response because I think he thought I was a bit of a nutcase. So anyway, when I was sitting at home looking out my window, and I look up and one day in this tree outside my window, and there's this pair of lorikeets, and they arrived on the cabbage gum, my front paddock, and they checked every single knothole on this stem, and they'd found one that just had a tiny, tiny little depression in it where the timber was, the dead timber was still visible. And I watched them, and so they went in and they pecked, and they took out a little bit and they chucked it on the ground, another one. So they did that every day for about 3 months. And now we're talking 4.5, 5 years later, and they still come back and do it, and they're in this far. So they've managed to excavate themselves a hollow that's that deep. And so it got me thinking, what about if we could just speed that process up? Surely that can't be that hard. So anyway, I looked out and I'd seen papers by, for example, Neil Survey, who's written on chainsaw carved hollows, and seen that people were carving hollows with chainsaws. But I was a bit uncomfortable about that process. So I don't know if anyone's seen a chainsaw carved hollow, but what it will do is, and I'll show some examples. Actually, I can probably do that if we just expand that and go to here. Chainsaw carved hollow, effectively, you come up to the tree, cut the side out of the tree, using the chainsaw bar, notch the wood out, jemmy bars, all sorts of things, pull that big log of timber out, get the plate of timber that you've cut off, stick it back on, glue it into place, screws, all sorts of things, drill a hole through it to let the animals in. Okay, rightio. So, but what's the problem with that? Well, number one, we've created a fail point on that stem. And number two, it's like that piece of timber is now dead. It might get grown back over by the tree eventually, or it may not. It might get burnt off in the process. So there was one project up north, bushfire came through after they'd done it, and they just ended up with a whole lot of letterboxes in the side of these trees. So not very useful. Anyway, so I just kind of, was thinking about ideas, thought I came up with a concept which was effectively some way to use a spinning cutting piece on a long stem that I could stick into the tree and move around. That's the basic idea. Found that, thought I'd find them on that people would be selling. Wasn't happening. Went to Bunnings, as we all do, and bought some parts, went home, gung-ho, tried to make one, and within 5 minutes it broken my hand. So realised that I'm not an engineer and I should stick to ecology. So I eventually found an engineer. He agreed to help me. We got to, and we then spent the next 2 years developing and refining this tool. And I'll be giving a bit of a demonstration of it later on after the event for those who are keen to come have a look. Anyway, so effectively what the tool does is I can now go and through a 5 centimetre hole, I can carve a cavity that will be within anywhere that I can reach within that tree through that 5 centimetre hole. It can sometimes get a bit awkward doing it, but it's feasible. So there's a couple of different versions of the tool, but effectively it's a 45 centimetre arc sweep that I can reach through that 5 centimetre hole. And why is that important? Well, as was talked about earlier in Chelsea's talk, where she said that the pygmy possums want to squeeze through a 21 to 38 millimetre entrance hole. Well, there's a myriad of other species that are doing exactly the same. So they're looking at predator avoidance. So they're saying, if I go and park my bum up in this hole here with a nice big entrance on it, brush-tailed possum is going to come and evict me, or someone's going to come and eat my eggs, or lace monitor is going to turn up and have a bit of a feed during the day while I'm having a snooze. And so they're looking to try and squeeze through the narrowest space they can. So this is an example of a squirrel glider coming in, bringing its nesting bedding material in. That's a hollow I carved 3 to 4 years ago. It's in a forest red gum down on a floodplain. The hollow itself, when I carved it, was a 5 centimetre entrance diameter, and then the cavity incised like this. So over time, what the tree did and what I expected it to do, it started to want to do what all trees want to do, which is close up the voids or the breaks in their outer tissue. And so for me, then I had to kind of come up with ways to control that closure. And so, for example, in that one, with the original one with the squirrel glider, that's not being controlled in any way by me anymore. That's the animal. So the gliders come in and they chew it to exactly the right shape and size that they want. And they'll spend ages doing that. And that particular hollow with the squirrel glider on it coming out, it's had up to 12 or 13 different species that will investigate that hollow in a 2-week period. So it just shows how important these spaces are for the fauna in these ecosystems. And I've had up to 3 species in it at once. There'll be a tree skink, a tree frog, and the glider will turn up and it'll want to squeeze in as well. And on the video kind of the cameras that I've got, they record sound, and you hear this kind of, it's the tree frog's going, well, bugger off, I'm in here tonight. Anyway, so it's fascinating to kind of watch all of these interactions and how everything happens. So the one in the middle is a thing called a phascogale. I don't think you really get it much in Sydney anymore, but it's certainly lots of it up and down the eastern seaboard. The one on the far left-hand side, it's this high off the ground. So it's in a spotted gum that had been snapped off, it had sent up another leader, and I just carved into that little kind of branch nub, carved the chamber in there and left it, and the gliders have found it and they're using it. So if I'm, and I'll talk a bit louder now because I'm going to stand away from the mic, that's okay, and I won't necessarily be able to hold it, or I can if you want me to.
I'm sorry, I've got
recording. Okay, so yeah. So another option to keep those entrances open where we're targeting species that aren't likely to want to chew on a kind of living tissue regrowing, is to do something like this. So what effectively I've done here is cut off and salvage the piece of timber, and I've carved it out. I'll now insert that into the tree. And when I say insert it into the tree, what I mean is I'll carve out a disc of bark and living tissue and maybe notch it into 2 or 3 year old wood. And then I'll insert that with the hole that I'm carving in the tree in the middle of that circle. I'll then screw with 2 or 3 screws, as light screws as I can possibly manage, screw that into place. And once it's screwed into place, I'm trying to align the new growth of all that living tissue with that rebate that's in there, or that notch out. The reason being, as soon as the living tissue locks that in, it's anchored. It's now biologically anchored into the tree. So what that's now done is, it means that I can put a piece of timber into a tree that will last a bloody long time. The tree's regrowth locks it into place. I can now control the entrance size and keep it to exactly what I want for the target fauna I want. I can also look at working out, minimise the amount of water that wants to run into that cavity. And additionally, and I think this is one that we're starting to find out now through all the hollows that have been carved, is that there are certain species that they'll just completely miss a hollow unless it's got a pretty obvious sign that there's a hollow there. So if I just have a blank hole inside of a tree, species will kind of fly by and not see it, or whatever it is. But that can be another important reason. So anyway, so we've the Hollowhog's now been out and being used for quite some time. We've I think it's not working. so for probably 3.5 years we've been out now doing Hollowhog work. There's roughly 200 sets of tools that are now out around Australia. So I've got people anywhere from Tasmania to Western Australia to Queensland, throughout New South Wales and Victoria, using tools. And that's a combination of things. So there'll be all sorts of different groups. I'm trying to work out where that is. So there's all sorts of different groups that are using the tools. So everyone from National Parks and Wildlife, LLS, landcare groups, loads and loads and loads of arborists, national parks. Again, as I said, the botanic gardens in Melbourne have got tools. So there's all sorts of different people using it for all sorts of different applications. So how does it fit in as a bush regenerator / restoration ecologist? What can you do with a tool like this, or with using this system? You don't necessarily have to use these tools. You can find another way to do it if you'd like. But yeah, with this particular concept of utilising the existing trees that you've got on site. So I probably should take a step back and say that we carve hollows both in living and dead trees. So it doesn't just have to be a dead stag that's being pruned and reduced and sitting there and, we're going to pop a little couple of hollows in it. If we can do it in a safe way, as in place these hollows in landscapes where there's not that much interaction going on between people and the tree and that stem, it's safe to put it into a standing living tree, and that standing living tree will continue to grow. We can remove as little as that much living tissue as part of the process. It can be sometimes easier to remove more, and we do that in certain instances. So say, for example, I had a relatively narrow stem and I wanted to carve a hollow. I could do this method here, which I call the slot method, which is effectively using a chainsaw, carving out a wedge-shaped piece of timber through which we then carve that hollow. And then at the end of it, it slots back into place. We put 4 screws to hold it in place and let the tree just wrap around it. It's akin to doing a chainsaw carved hollow, but you can imagine if that's on a stem that's this big, it's a tiny, tiny proportion of that stem and that structural strength of that plant stem. So it really, ends up being a bit of a non-event from the tree's perspective. It just closes it up. So I've got one at the moment. It'll be closed in a year. I carved it in October last year. So If you're in a landscape that's a dry landscape or harsher, it'll take a lot longer. Anyway, so as part of restoration ecology, so we've got groups who are doing this for habitat in trees. We've got groups that are doing it that only want to do ground habitat. So they're doing salvage log material that they go to local arborists. Hey, instead of mulching all that, can you chuck it in the back of my truck or my ute, and we'll go and we'll carve, we'll shape this and put this out in landscape. Got people working doing threatened fish species in the Murray. So they're carving multiple tiny little cavities into creeks that into logs that they then install in creeks. It's kind of endless as to what you can do. I've got people that do it for orchids, people that do it for terrestrial or terrarium type kind of businesses, all sorts of things, but miles of options. So one thing that I was thinking about from the restoration ecology side of things, and so bush regen, is when you guys are out there and you've been tasked with removing woody stemmed plants. So you might be going into a landscape, for example, on the New South Wales North Coast, which is chockers with camphor laurel, or some of these riparian habitat areas where it's just a forest of introduced species stems, and your task is to go and get rid of them. So instead of knocking all of those down, there's a couple of groups at least around that are doing this, and they go and they target those stems to carve hollows and habitat. And they'll carve the habitat in it maybe 1 year. They may install kind of entrances into stems, let the tree kind of regrow and wrap that around that so that it's anchored, and then they'll come back and stem inject or whatever they're doing the following year, ring bark it. So various options that you can kind of come up with about how to use the tools. How are we going for time? 8 time. Sorry. Anyway, so that's the concept. Very happy to talk to anyone and everyone about how we can do these projects and utilise the tools as part of what you're doing. There's a fair bit more info, and I could probably talk for a couple of hours, but very happy to talk to anyone downstairs and come and have a look at the demo. It'll kind of give you a bit of an idea of what you can do. Okay.
So we'll take questions now for 5 minutes.
Is there a way we can tell, do you have a list of arborists who know how to use it that, if I'm in council, that I could get in contact with?
Yeah, I'll put my contact details up for you. So yeah, just contact me. There's a list there. That's my contact details. So yeah, just give me a yell. Yeah, definitely. In Sydney, it's surprising. Sydney's actually had the lowest uptake of anywhere in the country, which I was kind of flabbergasted by. I don't know what it is, but there's guys on the northern beaches, there's guys in the Blue Mountains, and there's a couple of others. So yeah, there's a few around, but you possibly have to contract people in. There's lots on the Central Coast and Newcastle. So yeah. Yes.
With dead trees, are you limited to how many hollows?
No. So I think that's a kind of, it really comes down to the structural integrity, and that's it. Fauna will sort themselves out. Yes, there's a concern around putting too many of one particular type of hollow in a space, in a certain area, and there will be within species and intra-species competition that goes on, definitely. But look, my view is that we're never going to get to a point where we've replicated the number of hollows that have been lost. So just as an example, old growth forest, 150 hollows a hectare on average. Go into a state forest and you might be lucky to get 4 or 5 per hectare. And we're never going to get back to that. We've got trillions of trees in the country. It's often a concern raised by people like, oh, we're going to kill the trees, or we're going to kill all the trees, or whatever it is, or, we can't do this because we've got tree preservation orders and we're going to consider this as damage to vegetation, or whatever the terminology is. But I think that the critical thing is that the fauna that inhabit these forests are the ones that pollinate it. They're the ones that are the pest controllers. They're the ones that evolve there, and they should be there. And we should be thinking about it like that, not just the individual tree-specific one stem's safety or longevity. I did have sorry, and it's possibly going a little bit off topic again, but I did have what's called an AQF5 arborist. Some of you know what that is, structural arborist. I said after we carved this stem, I said, what do you reckon we've done to the longevity of that stem? He said, that's probably a 400-year-old, that would have been a 400-year-old tree when it eventually died. He said, it'll probably now be a 300 to 350-year-old tree. So honestly, there are so many other things that impact stuff out there. I think this is something that's worth doing. Yes? I'm extremely happy to talk about that because it was when I was developing these tools, the first thing I thought was, if I put this tool out, the arborist community are going to smash me because what am I doing? I'm going against their code of practice, which is all about urban and amenity tree. And so, yeah, that's right. So the biomechanics as well. And so that's all being considered as part of this. And so anyway, I've had 2 people come back to me, number 3 today, 2 people out of hundreds that I've interacted with that think this is incorrect. The majority of people with tools are arborists, just by the way, and they're the ones that are using the tools. And we're extremely cautious, and I'm extremely cautious in saying, whatever you do, if you're going to follow this process, get an arborist involved, because the arborist is the one that should be making the decision if there's any sort of structural loading. Look, and there's going to be instances where there's not structural loading. Yes, so that's true. And we've had so far 2 failures out of about 10,000 hollows that have been installed. And so there is a likelihood that in some instances you're going to get failures, no question of it. But the studies that I certainly did a lot of research on this before I got into it and looked into it. There's the mechanics of a tree work in lots of different ways. There's things like torsion, which get involved in when trees fail. There's all sorts of aspects to it. What it came down to was that the central third of a stem provides very little of that stem's structural integrity. The bulk of that stem's structural integrity is in the outer wall. And that outer wall, we're talking the outer 2/3, will provide the majority of it. And it's just plain old structural mechanics and stuff that's been written up in the arboriculture industry. So look, I recognise that definitely for some people, it's a no-go. And that's fantastic, fine. Yeah, from a risk perspective, but and the risk perspective is definitely something that I always consider. There's no way I would say go and do this over someone's house in their backyard. Wouldn't say do it. But if I'm going to go into a forest reserve and there's lots and lots and lots, and the majority of our forest reserves are still depleted in hollows. So that it's not accurate to point out that they're not necessary in those spaces, because we've been smashing them for the past 200 years, and that's why this is so important. And there's multiple research papers out there that will demonstrate that that's exactly the case. So there's ways to think about where this is appropriate and where it's not appropriate. Sorry, I'm probably taking way too long here. I'm keeping on going. Does that kind of answer some of it? I mean, I'm fully aware that some people won't be happy with this. Yes?
Matt, I was just, I know nothing about this, but it's really fascinating, and I applaud what you try to do.
Thank you.
I won't even comment on the validity or the outcome of the show themselves. So fantastic.
Thank you.
From my perspective, my only concern, and I'm not sure if it's a general thing with arborists' requirements for identifying culturally scarred trees,
definitely.
So is that a prerequisite for the arborists to see before they even make that? I'm not saying there's no place for it even for culturally modified trees. It might be a case of interfering with an Aboriginal site if they went ahead and did that.
100%.
So whether that opens up Pandora's box as well.
100%, and that's definitely a consideration, and it's definitely something that's factored in when people do their assessments. There are Indigenous groups that are doing it, just by the way, as well. So,
Yeah, cool.
And just as an example, we've had threatened species-wise, or species that are using hollows. We've got everything from microbats and native bees, and native bees are occupying Parramatta Council's land where we've carved hollows, and right through to powerful owls using hollows. So, it's an amazing kind of outcome in just a short space of time to see what we can actually do. I think it will be finding the right spaces and making sure the right controls are in place so that we can get this, we can get hollows into the landscape to make sure that fauna can persist. Yes?
Just continuing with the choice of trees, I know with my team at North Sydney Council, we will just be using dead trees like stags. So the sail has been taken off the top. So the trees that would have ordinarily been removed, say they were near a track and they were failing or part of it was failing, and this was just seen as a better option to provide some habitat rather than taking out the whole tree. So it's a matter of just making good choices for us.
Exactly. And I think that's what it comes down to, is good choices based on what are the concerns. So are the concerns around public and health safety and things like that, or are there other concerns? And if it's health and safety, well, you find a different space. So, yeah. Yes?
Just a quick one. It might sound like a bit of an odd question, but do you have an easy data list of habitat needs to species? So, for land managers, let's say they've identified a particular species in their area and they sort of, without having to do tons of research.
I do a one-page to people from what I've researched, and that will be, unfortunately, a lot of it is down to nest boxes because that's where the majority of the research comes from. But there are some fantastic studies that have been going on at the moment. So, for example, greater gliders down from Wollongong University, they're doing phenomenal studies, and they've come up with kind of exact parameters of what these animals will like. Invariably, what you see is that if you look at a nest box kind of requirement, the nest box has to be 600 deep by 300 by 400. Well, that's the size of a piece of plywood, and that's why it's kind of scaled like that. So we know that the critical thing is the entrance, and if the animal can squeeze in there, and they and their kids can squeeze in there or whatever, generally, you've probably provided adequate habitat. That's not always true. There's some species that won't even touch a shallow hollow. They want something that'll be a metre deep. So, it really depends. Yeah, but yes, I do have that. And when I sell tools, I definitely, that's what I do. Yeah. So we've got the other one at the moment. We've just been over with BirdLife Australia and Kangaroo Island. So they're carving for glossy black cockatoos. And so we've come up with a solution there where they probably have some stems that are going to be big enough, but not a lot. And so what we'll be doing there is we'll be doing half carved outside the tree, which is making a giant version of one of these, and then that will be rebaited, attached into the tree. So the cockatoos will get the feeling that they've got their metre deep hollow that they're after, but the majority of it will be produced by us outside. Tree locks it into place, and we've carved a little chamber at the base of it. So, yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt.